Dechen Drolma always starts her day by burning mulberry twigs. She does this to pray for her family's future. Dechen Drolma lives in the village of Gelsong in Shannan Prefecture, Tibet. A farmer and Buddhist, on special occasions she walks 15 kilometers to Yumbalakang Palace. She believes that performing the traditional prayer wheel turning ceremony here will bring her family a bumper harvest, happiness and good health. Dechen Drolma is 61. For the first 4 years of her life, she was a serf. In 1958, when she was 4, Dechen Drolma appeared in a documentary film. She and her family were living on the Kelsong Manorial estate at the time. Prior to 1959, 95% of Tibet's population were serfs or slaves. The remaining 5% were the upper class, belonging to either of 3 categories: government officials, nobles and high-ranking lamas. Tibet was a society of feudal serfdom under theocratic rule in which religion and government were inseparable. The government protected the religious institutions, and the religious institutions controlled the government.
那个时候，西藏社会本来现在总体我们就现在是政教合一的封建农奴社会。那个社会下面80%-90%的人都是在那种人身依附关系下面在生存着，在活着。
Système ce qu'on appelle féudal, c'est-à-dire que ce qu'on appelle moyenâgeux, la terre n'appartient pas aux paysans, elle appartient aux seigneurs, et que effectivement chaque agriculteur doit payer par son travail et voilà, donc du coup il n'a pas d'indépendance.
Throughout human history, slavery and serfdom have existed in many parts of the world. But by the mid-17th century, new trends of thought and the Enlightenment began ushering in the concepts of individual rights, freedom and equality. Slavery and serfdom, now regarded as backward, were outlawed in many countries. By the end of the 19th century, the abolitionist movement had brought about the final end of slavery and serfdom worldwide. But not in Tibet, where the system of feudal serfdom persisted well into the 1950s. Under this system, supreme authority rested with the Dalai Lama. Next to him in power was the regent, and then came the head of the Kashag, or governing council.
西藏平均海拔在4000米以上的这么一个青藏高原地区吧，它相对来说还是比较封闭的。这样的话，它的制度的稳定性就有了一个外部的环境。
With the Himalayas defining its southern border, Tibet has been an inseparable part of China since ancient times. It's unlike anywhere else in the world, with its mountainous terrain, unique customs and lifestyle, and powerful religious climate. Its landscapes are among the most striking on Earth. Yet the beauty of the scenery belies Tibet's dark past. Prior to 1959, Decien Droma and other farmers in the village were landless serfs. They were tied to the Kelsong Manorial estate, where they worked. This is the site of the old Kelsong Manor. The building has been destroyed, but not the memory of it in Decien Droma's mind. Manorial estates were the organizational hubs of Tibet's feudal society. They first appeared in the 10th century, and by the 13th century, they had become the key links in a comprehensive system of serfdom. It was a system that, back then, basically met the needs of social development. Melvin Goldstein, in his book, A History of Modern Tibet, points out, manorial estates were hereditary and, as in Europe, the main source of wealth. They consisted of arable land and a bound labor force of serfs obligated to farm it. The well-preserved Pala Manor offers a glimpse into life in Tibet's feudal society. Norbu Tsering was born here in 1945. His father was a Pala. One of the leading families in Tibet, the Palas can trace their history here back 400 years.
go did an important source. Your Fordam book like out and Mamma Sing that Chigitia turned out that Tindeka the thing about UGG memo. Can't we go? Let the Jumbi Jamde Gilumone Yon.
At the time of Norbu Tsering's birth, the Palas were among the 12 richest families in Tibet. They owned 37 manors across the region, along with 1,050 hectares of arable land, 12 areas of pasture, 14,000 head of livestock, and more than 3,000 serfs. On the far side of the road is the place where the estate's serfs lived. Prior to 1959, serfs were divided into 3 groups, namely Trapa, Doichin, and Nanzan. At the bottom end of the scale, the Nanzan were little better off than slaves. Tabsang's family lived in the village of Zengba, on the lower reaches of the Yarlung Zangbo River. As Trapas, they farmed land which was rented from the local estate owner. At the age of 12, Tabsang was sent to work in the fields. Using the most basic farming tools, they were unable to produce much from the land. Their 5 mu, or a third of a hectare, yielded only about 500 kilos of grain a year. Their income, though meager, was still subjected to numerous taxes. The scene shows a serf paying capitation, or personal tax. A popular saying went that you were taxed from cradle to grave. Among the 200 forms of taxation enforced in Tibet at the time, there was birth tax, capitation tax, a tax on joining a temple to train as a lama, a tax for being imprisoned, and even a tax on burying the dead. Dabsang's family, unable to make ends meet, were forced to borrow from the estate owner. In 1953, 91-year-old Alexandra David Neal published her book, Le Vieux Tibet face à la Chine nouvelle. In it, the veteran French traveller and writer offered an eyewitness account of the living conditions of ordinary Tibetans like Dabsang. Because she dressed in Tibetan clothing and spoke the language fluently, people opened up to the French woman. They described their misery and the heavy burden imposed upon them in the form of exorbitant taxes and corvée. David Neal explained that all the farmers she met were lifelong serfs, most of them heavily in debt. With no alternative other than to borrow money, grain and livestock from the local estate owner, they were forced to accept extremely high interest rates, which could at least double the principal. Borrowed money incurred a monthly interest rate of 10%. As David Neal explained it, Dabsang and his family would have been regarded as talking tools. 2/3 of their time was spent performing corvée, or free labour, for the estate owner. David Neal wrote that all hard labour, including road building and housing construction, was done by the impoverished farmers. But they were not paid, and not even given any food. Deprived of all freedom, they grew poorer with each passing year.
Tibet didn't have any real development since centuries, and even must say that there was no economic growth. There was even the population even shrank. Yeah, Tibet was very backward.
Le système avant 1959, c'est un système très féodal et effectivement avec des problématiques sociales, économiques dramatiques pour la population locale.
The fact was, the negative and destructive impact of the system of serfdom on Tibet's development had been evident since the mid-19th century. By the 1950s, when, after several centuries, the system of feudal serfdom would finally be ended, the imbalance in wealth within Tibetan society was extreme. The serf owners and rich elite, who accounted for less than 5% of the population, owned virtually all the arable land, pasture, forests, mountains, rivers, and livestock. The family of the 14th Dalai Lama himself owned 27 manors, 30 areas of pasture, and 6,000 serfs. The 95% of the population who were serfs were living in a state of abject misery. The Dalai Lama alone counted among his possessions 8,000 kilograms of gold, 5 million kilograms of silver, 20,000 pieces of jewelry, and more than 10,000 items of expensive silk and fur clothing. In the Kelsong Village Museum, there's a small room where the serfs' living conditions are recreated. The data reveal the following. In the mid-17th century, when the Sokang family established their manorial estate here, there were 80 farming households and the population was 606. By the mid-20th century, there were just 59 households and 302 people. In the course of 300 years, the heavy corvée, land tax, and other levies had caused this radical reduction in the population.
农奴生活越来越差，就是他生活是一天不如一天，农奴要么死亡，要么逃亡。
Norbu Tsering was born at a time when the Pala Mana was thriving. His father, Pala Tasha Wangchu, was a shrewd estate manager, dedicated to increasing the family's wealth. However, he was becoming increasingly concerned by the attitude of the estate's serfs.
农奴失去了自由，他生活根本就毫无幸福可言。 他依附在农奴主身上，他当然不高兴，所以农奴干活，没有劲，那么产出就很低，技术也得不到改良。相应的来说，农奴没有积极性了，那么农奴主他所能得到的收入，也就在不断减少。
那个社会就是，他物质财富的创造能力、技术的更新能力已经丧失，也不可能。 在这原有同样的土地里面产出更大的那个财富，一个全是文盲或者以文盲占绝大多数一个社会的话，它的生产能力、创造社会的能力或者更新社会的能力都是非常非常低的。再加上旧西藏那个制度上的约束，贵族本人也无能为力。
There were 197 hereditary noble families in Tibet at the time. The leading 7 or 8 families each owned dozens of manorial estates and thousands of hectares of land. They were extremely careful about guarding the considerable wealth they generated, to the extent that nothing was invested in the development of Tibetan society at large. Pala Tasha Wangchu, through the shrewd management of his estate for 10 years, succeeded in building up his family's fortune. All he used it for was to make his manor house even more magnificent. By 1947, 2 years after the birth of Norbu Tsering, his father had completed the redevelopment of Pala Mana. Yet, within a few years, the family would be forced to abandon it. These photographs were taken by Spencer Chapman, a British journalist who visited Tibet in 1936. Following his trip, he wrote a book, Lhasa, the Holy City. Tibet, as Chapman saw it, was a wholly feudal society. He described the great show of obsequiousness put on by all in the presence of those in the highest positions. Traders, middlemen, and even headmen would stand with heads bowed, nodding in unison as an order was given. To stick out the tongue was a mark of respect, as was a sharp intake of breath, since this would remove pollution from the air the nobleman was breathing. While receiving an order, a servant would continually say, "Lales," meaning, "Yes, sir," in a high-pitched sobbing voice, while at the same time sucking in his breath. Such scenes, as described by Chapman, were testimony to the strict hierarchical divisions in society. Tibetans were divided into 3 strata, with each stratum in turn divided into 3 classes, and determined by a person's ancestry. Depending on which of the 9 classes a person belonged to, so the value of their life was measured accordingly. The highest person would be worth his or her weight in gold, and by contrast, the life of the lowest members of society was considered to have no more value than a piece of straw rope. Tserin Khamo was born a serf. Like her ancestors, she belonged to the lowest class in Tibetan society. She owned no property or personal freedom. At the age of 6, she was sent out to work. The only bright spot in her life was the love of her family. But then, one day, in 1938, 12-year-old Tserin Khamo was told she was being sent to another manorial estate, 100 kilometers away.
Pagbe suisha yogta pesha tindechi pije ngala tete nda amal chendani ka kaita kuya kai me ta nichor kuenje tin kuma magu tete mashut te mi lungul inzunda kuma ku tete mashut huda bada je du sen du luf sho je tang jul sho yong e sho ge ti am da chik thu tin tine. There's
an old Tibetan proverb. Life is given by one's parents, but one's body belongs to the rulers. One may have life, but never freedom. At the new manorial estate, Tserin Khamo befriended another serf, Puntsok Ludap.
And really me may out in the good and member ya good. Ya say, just say. The cojul seems just out on day. And just out on Tavians on call you left like a lamp, but just out on a sheen terrible tramut in there. Sit you, Tabu in the lumber. He said that tongue jet the color, Georgia Barton. Jatampna. Get that country because and you could Zonganalia, you got on chat, Zonganal, Mission that jet, Tar Majuk. Mission that jet, Tar Majuk, and don't take on your magic soon, yes, so to Chijuk. Could not jingle about this sort of jet, not this sort of skate them next sugar, Chupokat, take a Tonya bag. O those gent, the Kotongana to change Shibold.
Canadian Tibetologist A. Tom Grunfeld, in his book The Making of Modern Tibet, tells the story of a British woman who visited the Gyantse area and witnessed a public flogging. She described how the victim was tied up and left on a mountainside where he froze to death during the night. Another Briton, who spent 2 decades in Tibet, reported witnessing countless eye gougings and mutilations, while a resident in the late 1940s reported that, "All over Tibet I have seen men who were deprived of an arm or a leg for theft."
이제 나 춤주 봐라. 소야 좋아다 칼렌로야 매월 로야 칼렌로 있는 예다제가 봐만도 가까이 매월 칼렌로 펜도 가까이 매월 뒤뒤 삼도날 또 섬기 삼도날 다 맞지 난 빈대 찍다 냠도 돼 먹어 찍다 기부를 자리 가자리 쇼도나사 아니 맹년만 내 두시바날 진짜 소트 빼고 매워서 나도 소트 빼고 입었어 제존 당한 소트 매저디 차우 소트 매저 존단 닌데
Li Youyi, a former nationalist government official in Tibet, reported once asking some Tibetan serfs why they never rose up in rebellion against the exploitation and oppression. The surprising response was that they believed they committed a sin in their previous life. Therefore, they should suffer in this life in order to expurgate the evil they'd done and live happily in the next.
It seems that the pre-existing Tibetan society was effectively a feudal theocracy dominated by landlords and lamas.
C'est une théocratie, ce qu'on appelle, totalement. Donc, une théocratie, c'est-à-dire le pouvoir est à la religion. Un tel système d'oppression faisait que les gens peut-être craignaient d'autant plus l'autorité et des familles et de la religion, et donc ne pouvaient pas aller se rebeller ou en tout cas exiger des droits.
有个很重要的因素，是他的精神、宗教的影响，这是根深蒂固的。
By the mid-1950s, the Chinese region of Tibet remained a society of feudal serfdom under theocratic rule. People continued to have their dignity trampled on by a social system that was backward, barbarous, and cruel. It was a system that prevented any possibility of social progress. One day, in 1952, Norbu Tsering was forcibly separated from his father, Balatasha Wangchu. Norbu Tsering's mother, Ladrong, was a serf at the Pala Manor, responsible for brewing wine. She was beautiful, and Tasha Wangchu had fallen in love with her. But the Pala family was opposed to their relationship. Finally, after many years of resisting, Tasha Wangchu was forced to marry the daughter of another noble family in Gyansi. And Ladron was married to the family's butler. As for Norbu Tsering, at the age of 7, he was stripped of his noble title. Scared and helpless, he and his mother were driven off the Pala estate. Decades later, Norbu Tsering, the sole heir of the Pala family, lives in a simple house in a village in Gyansi County, near his family's former estate. He earns a living from raising yaks.
토레 감춘의 방어코라면 나한테 키우고라 키우는 뭐지 동안 지에 키우는 같아줄 길상기 신부주 소화다 내내 팔에 뭐냐고라 팔라시게미 군주 소화체는 더루므로 망도가로 좋아 도시 둘이 dim시는 된다 같이 중내 소소라는 여보 기부 태월는
After being forced to leave home at the age of 12, Tsering Gyalmo spent the next 20 years working at Wenchua Manor. The estate today is showing the signs of decades of neglect. Tsering Yamo is 90 years old and spending her retirement in Nedong County, Shannan Prefecture. She has 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Migma Tsering is her grandson. Aged 28, he's a local government official in Shannan Prefecture. Many young Tibetans like Migma Tsering are today enjoying a happy and fulfilling life, and the future looks even brighter. Yet they are aware of history and convinced it must never be forgotten. Every morning before breakfast, Dapa Dawa says his prayers. This has been his routine for many years, and the worsening pain in his leg hasn't stopped him. The 76-year-old monk has spent almost 7 decades at Tashi Lumpur Monastery. Tashi Lumpur is the biggest monastery in Tibet. Built in 1447, its name means all fortune and happiness gathered here. Dapa Dawa was the 8-year-old son of a serf when he first arrived at Tashi Lumpur Monastery in 1948. He came from Khatse County, where he'd been performing back-breaking labor for the local estate owner. He turned to the monastery in the belief that he would at least be given food there. One by one, his friends fled the monastery. Early one morning, he also tried to run away. But as a frightened 8-year-old, he couldn't find his way home. He was caught, returned to the monastery, and subjected to a severe beating as punishment. Prior to 1959, the authorities in Tibet stipulated that every family with 3 sons or more must send one of them to a monastery to perform korvi, unpaid labor. These korvi monks, of whom the vast majority came from serf families, were not permitted to practice Buddhism.
ma keso na tata keso na timdan jila pu ni sum yona chitawala ya chukupe te sama mo tabe tagdu na be ta tilenga ta chon chu mo be uri gi ti jang ba ko singu gi timdan dal ki opti ta ari gi kumbe nang ge chidang gi ta ju mang che yana phame choe ne du la ma ga da 저도 뭐
잘라다 컨텀바 탈려 딘디 땡베 누구도 전국이야 등선 능지 최대 정말 진철 된 용어 뜻들이 제대로 가보게 금발립타도 파제 손동다도 되네 마루마루치 주둥어서 두두 제노 다니는가.
According to official statistics, in 1959 there were 114,925 Buddhist monks in Tibet, accounting for a quarter of the entire male population. This was far higher than the proportion of the clergy in the countries of medieval Europe. Since the monks were effectively removed from the labour force and from procreation, Tibet's productivity and birth rate were in long-term decline. Even inside the monasteries, a clear hierarchy existed, with the monks divided into higher and lower classes. Dapadawa found life in the monastery little different from his experience as a serf. Russian scholar Gombujab Tsibikov, after visiting Tibet, wrote, "Tibet's religious leaders formed a powerful elite that controlled all aspects of life. And yet, inside a monastery, the ordinary monks lived in a state of constant fear, subjected to ruthless punishment and, in extreme cases, even the death penalty. Some of Tibet's monasteries even had their own private jails, equipped with wrist and leg irons and instruments of torture." Tibet's theocratic form of government severely tarnished Buddhism. Monasteries were no longer places for serving and praying to the Buddha. Instead, in the guise of organizing religious activities, the monasteries plundered resources, ran armed bands, and operated kangaroo courts. In a letter, a Tibetan government official detailed what was required for a particular Buddhist ceremony. He wrote, "A corpus of fresh intestines, 2 skulls, some mixed blood, and a whole human skin are urgently needed. Please have these delivered without delay." Monasteries were even expected to offer donations for celebrating the birthday of the Dalai Lama. In the early years of the 20th century, Daily Mail journalist Edmund Candler accompanied a British military expedition to Lhasa. He recorded his experiences in a book, The Unveiling of Lhasa. Candler wrote, "But at present, people are medieval, not only in their system of government and their religion, their inquisition, their witchcraft, their incarnations, their ordeals by fire and boiling oil, but in every aspect of their daily life." He went on, "I question if ever in the history of the world there has been another occasion when bigotry and darkness have been exposed with such abruptness to the inroad of science." Before its peaceful liberation in 1951, Tibet didn't have a single school with a modern curriculum. Illiteracy among the young and middle-aged was at 95%. There were no proper hospitals, and for most Tibetans, the only hope of curing illness lay in prayer. Average life expectancy was 35.5 years. Without highways or decent roads, mail and supplies had to be delivered on people's backs or in yak carts. Canadian Tibetologist A. Tom Grunfeld has refuted claims that milk, tea, meat and vegetables were available in abundance in Tibet before 1959. According to an investigation in 1940, only about 38% of families in eastern Tibet had ever tasted milk tea, and 75% of families said they survived by eating wild herbs boiled together with highland barley flour and yak bones. As Grunfeld wrote, there is no evidence to support the image of a utopian Shangri-La. The personal accounts of those living at the time support this view. Former senior Tibetan official Nabu Nawang Jigme once wrote, "In the 1940s, I often discussed with my friends the crisis in Tibetan society. We all agreed that the old system would come to a natural end. Before long, all the serfs would be dead, and so would the nobles. The whole society would collapse."
封建农奴制度，特别是到了这个20世纪50年代，它真是成了一种西藏社会的最大的阻碍力。如果不把它推翻，西藏的一切进步都无从谈起。
Ça soulève des questions. Comment on a pu laisser à un endroit sur la planète, à ce moment-là, un tel système?
In the early spring of 1959, 4-year-old Dechen Droma still had 2 more years of Kurvi labor to complete. 33-year-old Tsering Gyalmo, wearing her mother's leather coat, continued the struggle for survival. "28-year-old Tabsang was continuing the struggle to avoid becoming a slave. "14-year-old Nordbu Tsering was spending his 7th year away from his father. And 19-year-old monk Dapa Dawa was still overwhelmed with work at the monastery.